Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to another super cool, epic, awesome YouTube video. And in this one here today, we are going to learn how to make realistic sounding bass lines using bass VST plugins. A lot of times in my beat making tutorial videos, I'll say something along the lines of, I'm going to be recording bass guitar, but you don't really need a bass guitar, you can use plugins for this. But I realized I've never actually made a proper video on how to get a good real sound from a bass VST. So here we are, doing that today. So first things first, I am using FL Studio, but this will apply to whatever DAW you use as well. But before you start clicking in notes and messing with knobs or anything at all, you have to make sure that you're starting with a good bass plugin, or you can also use a bass one-shot sample, but you have to make sure that initial sound is actually good quality. Because there's no way to just magically take something that sounds awful and turn it into something amazing. You may have heard the saying, garbage in, garbage out. Same vibe here. So today for this tutorial, I'm going to be using Ample Bass, which is just a free bass emulation plugin. If you somehow have a better free bass plugin than this, leave it down in the comments below. But pretty much as far as I know, this is the best free bass plugin that you can get. It has a lot of really cool features that make it sound a lot more realistic. For example, you can put these just random effects sounds in there. There's also different ways to do hammer-ons and pull-offs and other little things that they add in there to kind of humanize it. I'm going to turn both the auto buzz and actuation noise thing on and then just set them to 10% so it's not too much, but it'll be in there here and there. And then you can also mess with all of these settings as you see fit. But now that we found what we're actually going to use to create the bass sound, we have to think a little bit philosophically for a second. The bass guitar is a very interesting instrument because it kind of fits somewhere in between drums and guitar. As a bassist, you have both rhythmic and melodic responsibilities in the song that you have to balance out. But honestly, I would say that the utmost important thing as a bassist is just getting everybody moving and grooving. The bass guitar and the drums are going to work together seamlessly to help create that groove for the song. So when you're programming a bass line, you really want to build it around a drum pattern. So in this video, we're going to make a few different bass patterns based off of a couple different drum patterns. The first drum pattern is going to be this one, which is actually from my unreleased, soon-to-come lo-fi indie drum pack. I'm really excited about it. There's a lot of samples, a lot of loops in there, and you guys should be getting that sometime this month. Anyways, if you also have chords, that's going to help you to structure the bass even more. The drums will allow you to structure the bass pattern rhythmically, and the chords will allow you to structure the bass pattern melodically. But for this one, let's just go straight up bass and drums. Right now in my head, I'm hearing a little pattern that goes something like burn, 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 burn. So we're going to try to recreate that inside of Ample Bass. Okay, so this right here is the initial preliminary bass line that I came up with. So if you notice for a lot of the bass pattern, I'm focusing on one particular note with just a few accents here and there. That's how a lot of your bass patterns are probably going to look, because whatever note you're kind of focusing on at that particular time is the root note. If you have chords in here, it's going to coincide with the root note of those chords. But if you're only playing root notes on the bass, it's going to get a little bit boring after a while. There are songs that are like that in certain genres that's fine, but that's why we add little accent notes in there to transition from one root note focus to another. The way that I like to think about it in relation to an actual bass guitar is that these notes right here, they're a fifth apart. This one would be a major third. And a major third and perfect fifth are two very common intervals that personally I play on the real bass guitar a lot. But you don't really have to worry about all that. I would just say put in whatever notes sound good to you. And then at the end here, I just have a little walk down kind of thing. So this is just a good example of a simple pattern that's not going to be too simple to where it gets really boring, but it's also not super overly complex to where it takes away from the actual song. One other interval that you should know about is doing octaves on bass. An octave is literally just the same note but higher or lower. So you can do that by just copying a note over, and then on FL Studio you can do Control up, and then this will create an octave. Octaves are a pretty common thing to do on bass guitar, and they have kind of like a funky bass sound. Most often the way that they're used is coming right after the octave that's lower and with a very short note. So you're never really going to hear something like this. It's mostly going to be along the lines of this. Another thing that I like to do when I play real bass and when I program bass as well is to add little ghost notes in there. If we add this same note right in here, shorten it a little bit, and then turn the velocity down, It just adds a little bit more groove. So doing that in certain places can be really cool, and it can add a lot to your actual bass groove. And you can play around with this. You can shorten these if you want to. You can even make them longer if you want to. Whatever you think sounds good. So at this point, we've got a nice little pattern going on, but it doesn't really sound as real as it could. So this is where we get into the real small nitty-gritty kind of details that are going to make all the difference. First thing you want to do if you ever want to humanize something is just Alt-R on FL Studio. Just randomize the velocities. This applies to every instrument. If a real person is playing it, they're not going to play all of the notes exactly the same volume. Now what I'm going to do to really humanize this is take every note that hits on the one, so these right here, and we're just going to scooch them over ever so slightly. What this does is it creates a little bit of room for the kick drum and makes the kick actually sound a lot fuller. And a lot of times real bass players will be just a little bit slightly behind the kick drum to achieve that effect anyways. So you can do this every time there's a bass and kick hit at the same time. So like with this one as well, or just do it here and there, whatever you feel like. It's all about making it sound human, so it's not going to be perfect every time. Speaking of which, just in general on all of the other notes, you can go and move them ever so slightly so that they're not all right on the lines. Somebody who's playing bass guitar, unless there's some sort of human metronome, they're most likely not going to be playing all the notes right on the lines. Just try to experiment with this, because sometimes on certain songs, the bass might actually sound a little bit better being slightly ahead. Sometimes it might be better slightly behind, or sometimes you might think it sounds better directly on the grid. All right, so now we got this little vibe going on, which I think sounds really cool, but we're not quite done yet, because now comes the fun part, specifically with ample bass. If you go up to like the 7 octave range, you'll hear that this doesn't really sound like a typical bass guitar note. Up here is the effects section, and these are really good because when you're actually playing the bass, you're going to have the sound of your fingers sliding across the frets. You might do a little one of these, and you also might have some of these little slapping sounds in here. And I would really highly recommend changing the color of the notes, so all the effects will just be purple, and then you'll see that in the velocity thing as well. But yeah, so I think this bass pattern is good. We're going to pull in another drum loop, and I'm going to show you with a different kind of style. All right, so we got this one right here, which is a much more faster, upbeat kind of thing. Also from that lo-fi indie drum pack, which is coming soon. So this pattern, it definitely lends itself a lot better to more of like a boom, 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 boom kind of bass pattern. So we're just going to start off with a simple vibe kind of like that. All right, so we got this pattern right here. This is about as simple as it gets when it comes to bass lines. And it honestly doesn't really sound bad as is, but we can spice it up a little bit and make it a little bit better. So most of the same methodology as with the other bass pattern is going to apply here. Some little transition notes will sound good. For this last note, I'm hearing this one going up a little bit higher. And would you look at that, this interval right here is a perfect fifth. As you can see, unlike the other pattern, all of these bass notes are touching. For one, if we did this, it would sound kind of weird. Yeah, it just doesn't sound the same. If you think about this same thing on a real bass guitar, you're not stopping like this. It's all back to back. Pretty much at this point, we can follow the same humanizing procedure that we used on the other pattern. So randomize all the velocities, and then we can take the notes right on the one, shift them over a little bit, and the same vibe, just mess with all the timing of these notes right here like this. If you are in FL Studio, after you've done that, I would say hit Control L, and that's just going to make all the notes touch again. Another thing we're going to do here is something that I do pretty much anytime I'm programming hi-hats that I want to sound like real hi-hats, and that's basically lowering the velocity of every other hit right here. This is just going to add a lot more groove and bounce to this actual pattern. And when you think about it, it logically makes sense, because if you're playing this pattern like this with your 2 fingers, that first hit is always going to be harder than the second middle finger hit like that. So yeah, honestly, at this point, I think this pattern is pretty much good. Really, the other 20% of how we're going to make this actually sound realistic is going to be in the mixing, which I'll show you guys in a little bit. So the last example that I'm going to give is more of like a slow chord duster-esque kind of drum pattern, which is also part of my lo-fi indie drum pack coming soon. So this one we're going to approach kind of like a slowed down version of the last one I just showed you. As you can hear, I went with a super duster-esque vibe. We're just going to go through the same philosophy, randomizing all the velocities. And then for this one, I think it's especially important that we accent those beginning notes here like this. So I'm going to make sure that these are louder than everything else. And then just do the same thing where we're alternating the velocities. We're going to take all the notes on the one and just move them over slightly. And you already know, just mess with the timing of all the other notes as well. For this one, I'm definitely going to do a little slide sound effect every time the chord changes or the root note changes. So just taking one of these and placing it like here. And then I'm just going to take all of these and bring the volume down quite a bit. These sound effects are great for making the bass sound more realistic, but if they're right in your face and super obvious, it just defeats the whole purpose. So now at this point, you pretty much get the idea of how to make a bass pattern that's realistic, but how do we make that bass actually sound realistic? That's what I'm going to show you with mixing right here. So I'm just going to mix this exactly the way that I would mix a normal bass guitar. However, the one thing I'm going to do differently is something that I do within my actual bass guitar. We're going to put an EQ on this, and we're just going to roll off some of the high end. That's basically what a tone knob does on a guitar of really any kind, but for some reason in ample bass, they don't have that feature, so we're just going to do it with the plugin. So now that we have that, I'm going to put our bass on here, which is one of my favorite bass plugins to use. All these plugins will be linked in the description below if you want to go check them out. We're just going to take the intensity and bring it down, take the gain, bring it down. And then this frequency setting is basically going to accentuate a specific frequency within the bass. So if we go way up here, you get a much more nasally bass tone. But if we're down here, it's much more deep and boomy. I usually have it somewhere in between like 85 to like 120. This honestly just completely depends on all of the other instruments within your song and what frequency sounds best in accordance to those other instruments. But now that we have this up in here, I'm going to bring in the other plugin that I pretty much always use, which is this T-Rex Black 76 compressor. I'm sure you can use pretty much any 76 emulation, but this is just one that I happen to like. You can hear this just adds a lot of warmth and grit to that bass sound. And now finally, I'm going to take an EQ. We're going to slightly boost around 100 Hertz, do a little cut around 600, and then actually bring in a little bit more of the high mids to mid frequencies. And then also if you want, depending on your song and the genre that you're making, you can add a little bit of distortion on this thing. I would probably put that effect before the compressors and everything, but feel free to do whatever sounds best for you. There's also a million other effects that you can add. You can add some chorus on there. The world is your oyster when it comes to personal bass mixing choices, but I think this sound right here is pretty much a good standard to shoot for. So yeah, honestly, ladies and gentlemen, I think that is pretty much going to do it for me in this video here today. At this point, you should, hopefully, if you've been paying attention, you should know how to make your own programmed VST bass plugins sound like a real bass, or as close as you can get to one. With stuff like this, it's always going to help if you have some other instruments involved, especially if they're live instruments, especially live drums. Conveniently, on feezostore.com, there's quite a few different drum packs that you can get that have live recorded drum sounds in them. So that might help you out. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed, and I will see you all next time.